This is hands down one of the most jaw-dropping moments ever caught in first class. Imagine sitting in your rightful seat, only to be told you don't belong. Now, imagine that happening to a Hollywood legend. What happened next? It wasn't just shocking. It became a viral storm that cost someone everything. But here's the twist. Clint Eastwood didn't even have to say a word. Stay with me, because by the time we land, you'll see exactly how one mistake spiraled out of control, while the internet did what it does best. And trust me, you won't believe how it ends. If you love stories packed with tension, justice, and unexpected twists, hit that like button, subscribe, and let's dive in. The flight was smooth, at least it was supposed to be. In first class, glasses clinked softly, pages of in-flight magazines rustled, and the glow of phone screens reflected in weary eyes. A quiet, effortless kind of luxury. But then something shifted. Not in the turbulence, not in the hum of the engines, but in the air itself. A flight attendant, sharp-eyed and purposeful, moved down the aisle. She stopped. One row, then another, then him, an elderly man, his hat tipped just slightly forward, sat with hands resting loosely in his lap. He wasn't doing anything unusual. He wasn't bothering anyone. But her gaze hardened. She didn't smile. "Sir," she said, her voice clipped, "you need to move to economy." For a moment, nothing changed. Conversations paused mid-sentence. A few heads turned. Then more. The man lifted his gaze, slow, deliberate, not startled, not defensive, just patient. Without a word, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his boarding pass. First class, printed in black and white, undeniable. He held it up. The flight attendant barely glanced. "There's been a mistake," she said. "You're not supposed to be here." Passengers exchanged glances. A murmur rippled through the cabin. People recognized him. The jawline, the presence, the weight of history etched into his face. But she didn't. A businessman in a tailored suit nudged his wife. "You see this?" he whispered. She nodded. Her eyes locked on the moment unfolding before them. "I'm in the right seat," the man said, his voice even. "Check your list." But the flight attendant didn't move. She squared her shoulders. "I don't need to check." Her words were crisp, confident. "This is a first-class cabin. You need to leave." And just like that, the whispering turned into something else. A passenger pulled out their phone, camera rolling. A second attendant hesitated in the aisle, glanced at the confrontation, then disappeared toward the front of the plane. The tension thickened. Seconds later, a new figure arrived. The flight supervisor. She bent slightly toward the man, her voice lower, more measured. "Sir, may I see your ticket?" Without hesitation, he handed it over. She scanned it, checked her tablet, then glanced at the flight attendant. A beat of silence. "This is his seat." Passengers shifted. Some smirked. A few shook their heads. But the flight attendant wasn't done. She took a step back, her stance firm. "He's causing a disruption." There it was, the phrase that changed everything. A flicker of something crossed Clint's face. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even surprise. Just a quiet recognition, like watching a storm roll and when you already know it's too late to run for cover. Across the aisle, a woman in a navy blue pantsuit exhaled, shaking her head. "Unbelievable," she muttered. A few seats down, a businessman in his 50s leaned forward, his voice low but firm. "Ma'am, you're the one making a scene." The flight attendant ignored them. "I'm going to have to escalate this," she said, tapping her earpiece. A sharp intake of breath from somewhere in the cabin. "She's doubling down," the businessman whispered to his wife. "Bad move." A new ripple of tension rolled through first class. The quiet murmurs were shifting now. Not just whispers of curiosity, but something heavier. And then, the moment that changed everything. "He refuses to move," the flight attendant announced, her voice carrying. "He's being aggressive." The shift was instant. Passengers stiffened. Eyes widened. The weight of that word settled over the cabin like a fog, thick, unshakable, aggressive. The kind of word that turned misunderstandings into headlines. The woman in navy stood up. No, he's not. Another voice. A man from the back. We've been watching the whole time. Someone else. You're the problem, lady. And now, the businessman wasn't just watching. His phone was out, the screen glowing. What's your name? He asked the flight attendant. Her face tightened. A tap came over the intercom. The pilot was calling the supervisor. She stepped away to answer. Meanwhile, Clint still hadn't moved. He didn't argue. Didn't raise his voice. Didn't need to. The room was speaking for him now. The young flight attendant, standing there, hands on her hips, suddenly realized, too late, she had lost control of the moment. The energy in first class had shifted completely. Passengers weren't just watching anymore. They were engaged. Phones were out. Cameras recording. Murmurs turning into something closer to judgment. And Clint, he just sat there, hat tipped, gaze steady, watching it all unfold. The flight supervisor returned, eyes scanning the tense cabin. Her earpiece was still live, but she didn't need an update to know what was happening. She exhaled slowly, then leveled her gaze at the attendant. Miss Reynolds, she said, voice even. We've reviewed the manifest. Mr. Eastwood is in his assigned seat. There's no issue here. Silence. Miss Reynolds' jaw tightened. She was too deep in now. He's making me uncomfortable, she said, her voice firm, but laced with something unsteady. And if I feel uncomfortable, I have the right to escalate. A low sound rippled through the cabin, part disbelief, part quiet amusement. From the back, chuckle. Oh, you've got to be kidding me. The businessman let out a sharp breath. This just went from bad to worse. The woman in navy crossed her arms. So now we're calling discomfort a safety issue. Miss Reynolds squared her shoulders. I'm notifying ground security. And that was the wrong move. The businessman turned fully in his seat, holding up his phone. You do know you're being filmed, right? She hesitated. He tilted the screen just enough for her to see. This is already online. For the first time, a crack in her confidence, a flicker of hesitation, a glance at Clint, as if hoping for some kind of support. But there was none. The supervisor stepped forward, her voice quieter now. Miss Reynolds. A word. Now, I have the right to. But the words didn't come, because at that moment she understood. No one was backing her up. The passengers weren't on her side. And more importantly, the internet was watching. Stiffly, she turned and followed the supervisor down the aisle. The tension didn't break. It just hung there, crackling like static electricity. Passengers exchanged glances, a silent understanding passing between them. A few phones were still recording, waiting. And Clint, he still hadn't moved. A few rows back, a man in a baseball cap leaned toward his wife, shaking his head. This is going to be everywhere by the time we land. She didn't even look up from her phone. It already is. The first clip had hit Twitter 5 minutes ago. 30 seconds of raw, unfiltered footage. Miss Reynolds, standing tall, voice sharp, demanding Clint Eastwood move. His quiet resistance. The murmurs in the background. Retweets were climbing by the second. One post read, "This girl just tried to kick Clint Eastwood out of first class. Someone come get her." Another, "Imagine not knowing Clint M.F. Eastwood when he's sitting right in front of you." And then, the internet did what it does best. Someone had already added the Dirty Harry theme to the video. The businessman's wife held up her phone, showing him the edit. He chuckled. She screwed. A ding from the overhead speaker. The captain's voice came over the intercom. Steady, professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking." Anyone who flew often knew what that meant. Something was happening. The flight supervisor returned moments later, her posture straighter than before, her expression set. She cleared her throat, then spoke. This time, directly to Clint. "Mr. Eastwood, I'd like to personally apologize for the misunderstanding." And just like that, the narrative snapped back into place. Passengers exchanged glances. Some nodded. A few clapped lightly. The businessman smirked. Clint finally moved. Not to argue, not to gloat, just a small, almost imperceptible nod, because the apology had been made, on record, and with every second that passed, the ground below was catching up to what had just happened in the sky. The plane hummed with tension, a strange mix of relief and anticipation. Miss Reynolds hadn't returned yet, and no one believed for a second that this was over. The businessman's phone buzzed. He glanced down, then let out a low chuckle. "Oh yeah," he muttered. "She's done." His wife peeked at the screen. Breaking: Clint Eastwood targeted in bizarre first-class dispute with airline staff. Another post surfaced, a second angle, shot from across the aisle. The moment Miss Reynolds doubled down. The moment she said Clint was making her uncomfortable. The internet wasn't just watching anymore. It was feeding. A brutal comment thread stretched below the video. She really bet her career on a losing hand. Man just SAT there like a boss and let the internet fight for him. The businessman smirked, shaking his head. A metallic click from the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we appreciate your patience. We are now making our final approach for landing. Cabin crew, prepare for arrival." The timing? Not an accident. This wasn't just the final descent to the airport. This was corporate damage control. Passengers exchanged knowing glances. The businessman whispered to his wife. "They're waiting for her at the gate." A few rows back, someone muttered, "You think she knows?" She didn't. The wheels hit the tarmac with a jolt. The usual announcements played, but no one in first class reached for their bags. They were waiting, and then there she was. Miss Reynolds appeared at the front of the cabin, her face pale, lips pressed into a tight line. Gone was the sharp authority. Gone was the confidence. Instead, she moved like someone trying to act normal, while knowing every single pair of eyes was on her. And they were. She didn't look at Clint, didn't acknowledge him, but she knew. The businessman checked his screen one last time. Over 3 million views. He muttered under his breath, "It's live." Miss Reynolds glanced in his direction, saw the glowing screen, the headlines. "Flight attendant picks the wrong fight." The woman in the Navy suit leaned over to Clint, lowering her voice. "She's gonna wish she stayed home today." A final ding. Seatbelts unlatched. Overhead bins popped open. But still, no one rushed to leave. Then, the real show started. A suited airline official stepped on board, flanked by 2 others. They weren't looking for a passenger. They were looking for her. Miss Reynolds barely had time to process before the first official, mid-40s, serious expression, whispered something in her ear. Her face drained. Passengers shifted, pretending not to listen. But the tension was electric. A few people had put their phones down now, almost feeling bad for her. Almost. The airline official stepped back, nodded to the supervisor, and then, without another word, Miss Reynolds was escorted off the plane. No scene, no yelling, no arguing, just the quiet realization that her career had ended before she even left the runway. A few passengers clapped, some loud, soft, knowing chuckles. The businessman shook his head. She really thought she could get away with it. Clint exhaled through his nose, stood up, adjusted his jacket. As he stepped into the aisle, he nodded once to the supervisor. She nodded back. Silent. Understood. Then he walked off the plane, and the internet finished what it started. Reputation is a strange thing. It takes years, decades, to build, but only seconds to unravel. One decision, one misstep, and suddenly, the world isn't on your side anymore. Miss Reynolds didn't lose her job because of one mistake. She lost it because she doubled down on the wrong one. It wasn't the misunderstanding that sealed her fate. It was the refusal to back out gracefully when the truth was right in front of her. How often do we see this in real life? Someone makes a mistake, nothing irreversible, but instead of acknowledging it, they dig in their heels. They argue. They let pride take the wheel. And by the time they realize their miscalculation, it's too late. The audience has already turned against them. Pride is a heavy burden. It blinds. It isolates. And in an age where every action is witnessed, recorded, and dissected, there's no longer a quiet corner to lick your wounds. The world moves fast. It judges even faster. But Clint Eastwood? He understood something deeper. He never needed to fight, never needed to raise his voice, because his power wasn't in what he said. It was in what he didn't say. The world fought for him because he didn't play into the spectacle. He knew when to speak, when to wait, and most importantly, when to walk away. We all face moments where we're tempted to defend the indefensible, to argue for the sake of being right. But true strength, true wisdom, it's knowing when a fight isn't worth having. Because sometimes, the most powerful response isn't to retaliate. It's to stay silent, let the truth unfold, and let the world do the talking.